Okay, so last time we talked about graphs and how we can represent graphs, and we'll go into more detail about how we can represent graphs. But before we start, any questions about the things we have covered so far? Type in no if you don't have any questions, or type in yes if you do have any questions. That will give me an idea. Perfect. Okay, so last time we were discussing, okay, I get it. So you don't have any questions, so you won't have any issues when we have our next quiz, I guess. Okay, so the last time we were talking about graphs and how graphs can be useful for different types of problems. We talked about a particular problem where we have this graph coloring problem where every country needs to be colored a particular color, but every neighboring country would have a different color. We represented that as a planar graph where every country that is adjoining to a particular country is represented by a particular edge. And I asked you guys to figure out whether um, we can have an overlapping edge in terms of a country map. Right. So so Brazil here is adjoined by, let's see, I am very bad at geography, so give me one sec. So I guess Brazil here is adjoined by Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, and I'm sure Argentina. Yes, Argentina, and all of those other countries, right? So we represent this particular map using a graph where Brazil would have a connected edge to every of its neighboring countries. But we also said that a map can only be represented as a planar graph. So a continent or the entire world can only be represented as a planar graph. And I am pretty sure that none of you worked that out yet, but I actually want you guys to understand and draw a mental map as to how every country, when connected to a different country, is always going to be a planar graph. And when we have a planar graph, it is always going to require at least and at most 4 colors to color every color country such that no two neighbors have the same color. There is no way, since the map is on a surface, a non-planar graph can't lie on a surface such as a map. So, Brian Neese, explain to us why no two countries can have overlapping edges.
So the whole like definition of a planar uh, graph is that you would have intersecting edges. You have no intersecting edges.
Yes, you can't have.
So you'd have to basically connect an edge in a third dimension, potentially, such that those
Exactly.
links would not cross. And in doing so, then you're like no longer representing that graph on a, you could think of like basically a map. It's no longer planar. You now have to take basically draw a line in the third dimension and hop over that other edge, essentially. That makes sense.
Exactly. I mean that is very, very interesting to me. I mean, it might not be that interesting to you guys because I'm not explaining that in much more detail, but Brian is correct. So imagine a map, right? A map, and we talked about this earlier, where 4 nodes can still be connected completely in terms of a planar graph, right? So we can say that we have 4 nodes here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and assume that these are all equally sized nodes because I'm bad at drawing. We can have a complete graph, that is every node is connected to every other node. And so that would mean that we would have a connection from this node to this node. And and we would also one sec. Imagine that these two nodes are connected, and it means that 4 nodes can be connected directly in a graph without any intersections. But whenever we move to a 5-node graph, we cannot have a complete graph with non-overlapping edges. And that is very interesting when you apply the same thing in terms of countries, right? That just means that 5 countries cannot be a neighbor to every other country as well. Right, so that is a very weird hypothesis that we have, and that is a very nice thing to figure out about. Okay, so we also talked about how different graph algorithms are, in a sense, abstract, in the sense that we are trying to solve a particular weird coloring algorithm, but we can also map this particular graph algorithm to another problem, such that, for example, we talked about the problem where a university tried to schedule the final exam for all their students, and it needed a solution for the particular problem, such that no 2 exams where a student is a student of both of those classes has an exam at the same time. Now we discussed about this earlier, but I'm going to repeat the solution here now. So we can imagine that every vertex in that particular solution is a class, and every edge between those 2 vertices is basically a student, or there exists such a student that takes both of those classes together. In that case, both of those vertices become neighbors of each other because there is a student edge between them, and that means that there is a vertex between those 2 vertices that that there is a student that takes both of those classes together. And that means that we cannot assign the same time slot for both of those classes because there is a student that takes both of those classes, and we can sort of map that to our graph coloring problem, right? Where no 2 neighbors can have the same color. And in this scenario, no 2 neighbors can have the same time slot to have the same exam. Does everyone remember what we covered last time?
Is that saying that problem can be represented with a planar graph? Or have we not determined that yet?
Not necessarily. I mean, this secondary problem cannot be represented, potentially cannot be represented as a planar graph. But the internal, so a planar graph just states that we just need 4 colors to color every other node. But this particular problem is not a planar graph, but the problem is the same. Does that make sense? And who asked that question?
That was me, Brian.
Brian Akins or Nice?
Nice.
Okay. So imagine a case where a student takes, so you can imagine a case where we have, I don't know, multiple classes. And a student takes this class, and a student also takes this class, and there is another student that takes this class, but also takes this class, but there is a student that takes this class, and this is still not.
Oh, would all classes be connected? Oh, every class that they had would have a line drawn between every other class that they took, right?
Exactly. So if there is any one student that takes both of these classes, there is an edge between them.
Right. And then, so it would generate a complete graph essentially for
potentially yes, right. So we can have a case where every student takes every other class. In that particular scenario, we cannot find any particular time slot which applies to everyone unless we have 5 different time slots.
Oh yeah, okay.
Right, that makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So potentially we can have a graph that can have multiple connections between every edges, every vertices, and we can say that this is not a planar graph because we can have overlapping classes, right? We can have overlapping classes in the sense that there are multiple classes, more than 5, where multiple students take multiple classes and they cannot be untangled in a sense. In that particular scenario, we cannot have any particular case where every student can take every class and have different class times if we different exam times if we only have 4 exam slots. Does that make sense? And I want you guys to type out the answer while I get my classes. Give me 1 second.
So the time slots are essentially the colors, right? And then you're saying that if a student has like more than 4 classes, then it could have a non-planar graph, and therefore you need more than the 4 time slots.
Okay, so I don't see any other answer. So that basically means that I have one answer. So that basically means that none of you understand. Okay, so let's take an example. Let's say that we have 4 classes. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, the complete graph, that means that every node is connected to every other node. That means that we have this connection, we have this connection, we have this connection, and for this node we have this, we have another node connection here, and we also have another node connection here. So the second node is also connected to all the 3 other nodes, and for this particular node it's already connected to these 2, and we have another connection here. Now, if we somehow reorient this graph, does everyone agree that this is a planar graph?
Yes.
Perfect. Right, so everyone agrees that this is a planar graph. Okay, so now I'll redraw this such that this is a planar graph. And I have a connection here. We have one connection missing, and I'll draw a curve for that. Right, these 2 edges are not overlapping, just deal with it. But this is how we get a planar graph for 4 nodes. But let's say that we have one more node here, right? So this particular node needs to connect with this node, that is still a planar graph. This connects to this node, that is still a planar graph. And I also need to connect to this particular node, that still keeps it a planar graph because no edges are still overlapping. Assume that this is not overlapping. So this set of edges are not overlapping. But the moment that we try to connect to this particular edge, we see that this particular node, we see that either way we turn this edge, it is always going to overlap with one or more edges. Does everyone agree that a graph with 5 nodes cannot be a complete graph and be a planar graph? I understand that you guys already understood the question that I was trying to ask, except Tejaswini. So Tejaswini, the thing that I'm trying to ask is,